My name is Mr.Barnett, and I'm with SMYAL, which is the Sexual Minority Youth Assistance League. We're an organization that supports lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. And I'm here today to talk about how we can really, as a community, work to empower LGBTQ youth as leaders. A lot has changed in the world in the last couple of years for LGBT people, especially here in America. We can look to events like President Obama just a few weeks ago declaring his support for same-sex marriage equality. We can also look at things like the popular television program, I guess my slides aren't coming up, Glee, where there's an openly gay character, Kurt. And it's really tempting to look at all of these changes and say, oh my gosh, this is fantastic, we're on the right path, things are great, and things must be so much better for LGBTQ young people. We also know that the average age of coming out has come down significantly over the years. In fact, according to the Centers for American Progress, the average age of coming out for LGBTQ youth now is age 13. And let me step back for a second. When I say LGBTQ, I mean lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. And I know LGBTQ can be kind of a mouthful, but it's really important to me to be inclusive. So that's the term I'm going to use, and that's what I mean by it. So the average age of coming out now is 13. And coming out is when an LGBTQ young person shares with their family, with their school, with their peers that they are LGBTQ. And when I actually share this statistic a lot, and when I'm talking to adult members of the LGBT community and I share that the average age of coming out is 13, there's generally an audible gasp in the room because the age has come down significantly. In fact, only 10 years ago, it was closer to 23. And so you think about where a person is when they're 23 versus where they are when they're 13. 23, perhaps they've already completed a 4-year college degree or a 2-year college degree. Perhaps they're living on their own. Perhaps they have a job. And when you're 13, you don't have any of those things. And generally speaking, you're living with a parent or guardian, and you're really dependent upon those people for support. And you're also an adolescent. And so the support and acceptance of your peers is also incredibly important. And you also have the developmental and emotional skills of a 13-year-old, which are not necessarily as advanced as a 23-year-old. So coming out 13 really presents a very different experience for LGBTQ youth today. And unfortunately, I wish I could stand up here and tell you that it's great and that things have gotten a lot better, and the fact is that's not true. LGBTQ youth continue to be at higher risk for a number of negative health outcomes, including HIV and STD risk, including substance abuse, alcohol abuse. They're at greater risk for encountering bullying and violence in their schools and in their communities. One need only walk down the hallways of any school in America, including those here in DC, and you'll hear young people saying things like, that's so gay, to mean that's so stupid, or you'll hear no homo is also very popular now. And those messages send a very clear message to LGBTQ young people that this is not a safe space for them. This is not it's not a safe space for them to be who they are. We also know that LGBTQ youth encounter much greater levels of bullying and harassment than just hearing people make stray comments like that. They are often teased in their classes. We also hear about young people who are being physically threatened and assaulted in our schools and in our communities. And so we know that as a community, we have a lot of work left to do. And it's wonderful that we have Kurt from Glee. It's wonderful that we've got national leaders really stepping up and voicing their support for LGBTQ youth. But we know that we're not really going to create the change that we want to see and create communities and families that are truly safe for LGBTQ youth until we really transform our culture. And at the heart of it, one of the fundamental problems that we have to tackle is the fact that we live in a culture that is, on a fundamental level, heterosexist and homophobic. We live in a culture that gives privileges and rights to people who are heterosexual, sometimes at the expense of people who are LGBTQ and who don't fit in those boxes. Think back to the last movie that you saw in the theaters, everyone in the room. And it has to be a fiction movie. It can't be a documentary. And it could have been last week. It could have been 3 years ago. But the last movie that you saw in the theaters. And raise your hands, if you will, if the movie included a heterosexual love story. So two people, you can start raising them. So two people who were either getting together, falling in love, breaking up, hooking up, getting married, who were members of the opposite gender. So like almost everybody has their hand raised. A few people don't. I raised my hand. I think the last movie I saw was The Avengers, and there was a love story in there somewhere amidst the alien invasion. And think back to that same movie and raise your hand if the plot included a same-sex love story. So two members of the same sex hooking up, falling in love, breaking up, getting married, or being in a relationship. So I see one hand, two hands. That's great. That's fantastic. Maybe there was a couple more out there. That's great. That's progress. But also think about how many of the movies that you saw had more than 10 characters in it. Like probably most of them. And statistically, we know that 1 in 10 people are, according to some studies, are LGBT. So representation is one issue. That's just one example of the fact that our culture is still, in very many ways, heterosexist and homophobic. We also know that folks who are LGBT don't always enjoy the same rights. This can include things like the right to marry one's partner. It can also include the right to be free from employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And by the way, in America, 48% of Americans aren't covered by any law that would protect them from that kind of employment discrimination, which I always share because according to other studies, 90% of Americans believe that there is some federal law that bans that, and that's not the case. So we have a long way to go. And for our young people who, again, think back to them, they're coming out at age 13, and they're encountering all of this. They're encountering perhaps rejection from their families, perhaps rejection in their communities, among their peer groups. And so it's very easy to think about them from sort of a pathology perspective and thinking about the services that they need. And for a lot of these young people, they certainly do need services. They might need access to mental health counseling. They might need access to housing services. Young people still do encounter homelessness on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But it's also important that when we're thinking about tackling these issues, we also think about LGBTQ youth as advocates and as people that we can be working with to address these. Coming out is a radical act of self-expression and one that has a real impact on not only the young person who comes out, but also the community that they come out in. When a young person comes out in their family, and they're the first person in their family to be LGBTQ, that impacts the entire family. When they come out in their schools, that impacts the entire school. And so these young people who are coming out younger and younger are already engaging in a really important form of self-advocacy. We also see that LGBTQ youth are capable of much greater, more organized levels of advocacy. There are things, student clubs all over this country called gay-straight alliances, which are very often student-run and student-driven clubs in local schools. Often, in many cases, students have had to really advocate within the school administration and among teachers to even get the right to have these clubs form. And they create safe spaces within a school for LGBTQ students, and they also raise the visibility of LGBTQ students among the entire school community. Gay-straight alliances and individual students have been involved in a lot of advocacy since these clubs first started becoming formed in the 90s. We've seen the National Day of Silence, which folks may be familiar with. This is a national day of action all over the country now. Students in middle schools and high schools and in college campuses take a vow on this one day in April, a vow of silence, and through their silence, they raise awareness of the silencing of LGBT students. And they force their classes, and they force their teachers, and they force their peers to really think about what does it mean to be LGBT? What is our community like for LGBT people? We also see LGBT student activists being really involved in advocating for policy changes. And that can include wearing the clothes that they're comfortable in to graduation that match their gender identity, match their gender expression. That can include wearing the clothes that match their gender expression to the prom. That can include bringing their same-sex partner or friend to the prom as their date. It can also include advocating for more inclusive policies to address issues like bullying and harassment in schools. And so LGBT youth are stepping up and are showing themselves to be leaders. They're showing themselves to be very capable of advocating for themselves. And again, like you think back, they're coming out at 13, they're taking these actions at 13, 14, 15. That's pretty phenomenal. It's pretty amazing. And so for all of us as adults who care about LGBTQ youth, who really want to make our community radically different, want to make our community one that is not homophobic, that's not heterosexist on a fundamental level, want to make our community one where coming out as LGBT is as easy as sharing your favorite color, we really need to be thinking about how we can work with young people, how we can build on the work that we're doing, that they're doing, and work together and make that change that we want to see. And so I hope you all will join me in doing that. Thank you.